Today's lecture, we are going to cover multiple groups comparison, ANOVA. In the previous lecture, we learned how to compare two groups, but what happens if there are more than two groups to compare? Let us first start off with a recap of last week's lecture. So last week, we covered the hypothesis. So there is the null hypothesis, the H0, and the alternative hypothesis, which is the H1. So the null hypothesis states that there is no difference, and the alternative hypothesis states that there is a difference. The next thing we covered is the p-value. So for the p-value, if it is more than 0.05 or if the 95% confidence interval includes 0, the chance for H0 is statistically possible, and hence we accept the H0. But likewise, if the reverse is true, then we will reject H0. So comparing two groups, we looked at the parameters that you need to fulfill in order for you to run a parametric test. So these are the parameters that need to fulfill. First, it needs to assume a normal distribution. So the clarification is that although biologic data might not be normally distributed, if we take multiple samples from this data set and we obtain the individual means, the means will be normally distributed. The next assumption that we look at is equivariance. And the third assumption we look at is random sampling from the population to form the sample. So if these assumptions are met, we use the parametric test. If the assumptions are not met, we use a non-parametric test. So you can look at the examples as below. Okay, so moving on to our main question for today, what happens if there are more than two groups to compare? How do we compare them? So we actually use ANOVA, which stands for the analysis of variance in such cases. Let us investigate this further. So the lecture outline for today is number 1, types of ANOVA, number 2, parametric one-way ANOVA, number 3, post hoc test, and then subsequently I'll be teaching you how to run the ANOVA test on the SPSS program, so make sure you have that downloaded. And then number 5, we are looking at the non-parametric one-way ANOVA, and lastly, the two-way ANOVA. So what are the different types of ANOVA and their indications and assumptions? So the different types of ANOVA, we have the parametric one-way ANOVA, non-parametric one-way ANOVA, and the two-way ANOVA. So there are a lot more other types of ANOVA, but these are the three ones that you might use. Okay, so but the most frequently used one is the parametric one-way ANOVA and the non-parametric one-way ANOVA. So for the first one, we only use it when we have a certain set of assumptions that are met, and the second one, we use it when the assumptions are not met, and then the third one is when we have two categorical independent variables to measure. In the parametric one-way ANOVA, we have a null hypothesis, which is there is no difference between all the means. So the indications for this ANOVA is that we want to test the quantitative difference between means of multiple groups. So the conditions for us to use this ANOVA is that we need to have a dependent variable that is quantitative and an independent variable that is categorical. So can you name me what is a quantitative variable and what is an example of a categorical variable? So the next, we have assumptions, which are, first, we need to have independent sampling or groups, which is random sampling, and then we need to have normally distributed samples, and we need to have equivariance, which is pretty similar to the t-test. So for equivariance, right, we actually test the sample and the data set based on the Levin test. So right, what happens if we reject the H0? If we reject the H0, we are essentially accepting the alternative hypothesis that there is a difference between the means. But when we reject the H0, we only can say that the means are not equal. But how do you find out which is the group that has a significantly different mean from the rest? This is where we need to cover and touch on the post hoc test. We need to run these post hoc tests on the data sets. So for the post hoc test, these are used in multiple pairwise comparisons to detect if there is any group that is has a mean that is significantly different. We can use this test to find out which group has a different mean from the rest. So the different types of post hoc tests, there's a Tukey HSD test. This is frequently used to test honest significant difference. And Dunnett's procedure, which compares against the control. The Chef's test, which is suitable for multiple contrasts. The Befferoni test / adjustment, which is very simple to conduct. And the Dunnett T3 or C test, when heterogeneous variances occur. So let us now run the ANOVA test on the SPSS program. So I'll require you to do this alongside me. Okay, so for the parametric one-way ANOVA, let's start with this question. Is there a difference between the mean game scores of the groups who like red, green, blue, white, and black? So for this data set, right, we're going to make use of the data set from your Fruit Ninja scores. So please just use that link that was provided to you. Okay, so this is the list of tests that we have to run. The first one is the one-way ANOVA test, followed by the Levin's test, and then the post-hoc Tukey HSD test. Okay, let's go to the different steps. Okay, before we actually go through everything, I'm just going to have a short disclaimer. Because as this video was made, you guys had not finished playing the game, so we do not have the exact results as what you will obtain later on. So the results and tables that will be displayed in this presentation are just a sample and are taken off the web, so you will see that the variables and the results are not the same as the ones that you obtain when you run the SPSS on your own dataset. So it's important to just save the tables that you obtain and the results, and then you can go through that in class. Okay, so next you follow the screenshot instructions on this set of slides and check the boxes as shown in the screen. This is the slide where you select the variables. Okay, so in step 4, we can select the post hoc test. So for this example, we are going to use the Tukey test. So you can choose to select other post hoc tests when they are appropriate. But for today, we are going to select the Tukey test. And then in the 5th step, we select descriptive and homogeneity of variances test. So descriptive just gives you a nice table later, and homogeneity of variances test is the same as the Levin's test, which tests for equal variances. Okay, so now we can churn out the analysis. Okay, so these are the different tables that we're gonna get. So the first table we're gonna get is for the Levin's test that we want to analyze. Okay, so Levin's test, right, as I said earlier, tests the homogeneity of variances, i.e., are the variances equal, and which is one of the assumptions of the parametric one-way ANOVA test. So if p is more than 0.05, we say that there is equal variance. If p is less than 0.05, there is no equal variance. So in this slide, I've boxed up the p-value, which is the same as significance. If there is equal variance and other assumptions of the parametric one-way ANOVA test are met, then we proceed to run the one-way ANOVA test. Otherwise, you'll run the non-parametric version, i.e. the Kruskal-Wallis test, which is the non-parametric one-way ANOVA. We'll cover that later. So in this example, we're just going to assume that the Levin's test reveals that we have an equal variance. The next table we look at is the ANOVA and the descriptives table. Okay. So again, we just look at the significance value and the 95% confidence interval for the mean. Okay, so if the p-value is larger than 0.05, or the 95% confidence interval includes 0, we'll accept the null hypothesis and say that there is no difference in means between the groups. But if the reverse is true, then we'll reject the null hypothesis. The last table we want to look at is the multiple comparisons table, which displays the result of the Tukey HSD post hoc test. So, a little recap, the Tukey HSD test was run to find out which group was the different mean. Okay, so this table compares each categorical independent variable to another. In the significance column, we look out for the p-values that are less than 0.05. This will indicate that the variable with the p-value of less than 0.05 when compared to other variables is the outlier. So in this table, I've already circled out the p-values that are less than 0.05. So what can we conclude from this slide. Okay, in this slide, we will conclude that the group that chose red as their favorite color is the outlier, i.e., the mean score for the first game is significantly different from the rest of the other groups. Okay, let us pause the video while you run the test. Some questions. What is the p-value that you get for the Levin's test? Are the variances equal? Assuming all the assumptions of the parametric one-way ANOVA test are met, we run this test. What is the p-value that you get and what is your conclusion? If the mean scores are significantly different, which is the group that has a significantly different mean score? Okay, so if the assumptions for the parametric one-way ANOVA test are not met, we must use the non-parametric one-way ANOVA, which is the Kruskal-Wallis test. So a significant Kruskal-Wallis test indicates that at least one sample dominates another sample. The test does not identify where this stochastic dominance occurs or for how many pairs of groups stochastic dominance obtained. A further post hoc test is required for that. Okay, that might sound very cheap, but you don't really have to worry about it. So we'll just look at the Kruskal-Wallis test. So similarly, the null hypothesis is that there is no difference in the mean. And then in the alternative hypothesis, there is a difference in the mean. So what are the assumptions? The assumptions, right, we do not assume a normal distribution and we also do not assume equal variances. But one other thing that is the same as the parametric version is that there is independence of observations, which means that there's no relationship between the observations in each group or between the groups themselves. Okay, the conditions for this test is that you need to have a dependent variable that is ordinal or continuous, and an independent variable that you have two or more categorical independent groups. So for the post hoc test, you will generally use a Dunn's non-parametric comparison, or we use the Mann-Whitney U test with the Bufferoni adjustment. Okay, so lastly, we're going to cover the two-way ANOVA. Okay, this is really FYI, so you don't really need to know this, but I'm just teaching you about this in case you ever need to use this. So the two-way ANOVA is used when there are two categorical independent variables to measure. Let me give you an example. Is there an interaction between gender and choice of color on the first game score among year 2 dental students? So over here, we have two independent variables, which is the gender and the choice of color. So all these will affect the dependent variable, which is the first game score. So it's actually quite simple, and you can also use SPSS to run this. So you can try that on your own, but we will not be covering that in the lecture. So also for the Kruskal-Wallis test, we will not be covering that in the lecture. So if you have any need, you can just Google it up on how to run it. Okay, so in summary, this is what we have covered. So if we have different groups A, B, C, D, and E, right? How can we analyze and compare the means, right? So we can use a few things. The first one we can use is the two-way ANOVA in the red box, okay? If there are two independent categorical variables. Okay, and then the other two tests we can use are the one-way ANOVA and Kruskal-Wallis test. So what are the parameters that we must fulfill for the one-way ANOVA? We need to have a normal distribution, random sampling, and equal variance. So for the normal distribution, you have to use the normality test. This one, usually you can use SPSS to run it also, but it's not taught in this lecture. Random sampling is just a way in which the samples were chosen from a larger population. And the third one we can use is the Levin's test, which is a test for equal variance, a homogeneity of variances. So if these parameters are met, we will use the one-way ANOVA, and we can run a further post hoc test, e.g. the Tukey HSD test, to find out exactly which was the group that had a different mean. So for the non-parametric version of the one-way ANOVA, we can use the Kruskal-Wallis test. Okay, so the further post hoc test can be either the Dunn's non-parametric comparison or the Mann-Whitney U test with a further Bufferoni adjustment. So you can go and Google those terms. We will not be covering that in this lecture today. Okay, so this is the end of the lecture. It's quite short. So we have some homework for you to do to try out this SPSS program. So you can read. Construct a new comparison research question. Don't use the one that I gave you in this slide. Okay. Based on the Fruit Ninja game data that you have collected as the whole class. Okay. To compare more than 2 groups. And the second thing is I want you to do is to run an SPSS for this research question to find an answer. So it's best if you can document how you got your results. So including screenshotting all the data and results and put them in a Word document so we can go through that in class. So if you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment below, or best just ask Prof during your lesson.